The scent of wood smoke, that was the essence of autumn for me. Crisp leaves underfoot, a pumpkin spice latte in hand, and the comforting aroma wafting from my chimney. It was perfection. That my name is Arthur Penhaligon, and until recently, I lived what I considered a blissfully ordinary life in the meticulously manicured suburb of Meadow Creek Estates. Meadow Creek was, on the surface, the epitome of suburban tranquility. Cookie-cutter houses lined perfectly paved streets, each lawn an emerald green, testament to the dedication, or, more accurately, the forced compliance, of its residents. We had block parties, neighborhood watch meetings, and an annual holiday decorating contest so fiercely competitive it could make gladiators blush. My home, a modest two-story colonial, was my sanctuary. I'd poured my heart and soul into making it my own, from the meticulously curated rose garden to the cozy, book-lined study. But the heart of the house, the thing that truly made it a home, was the fireplace. Every evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, I would gather logs, kindling, and newspaper, and meticulously build a fire. The crackling flames, the gentle warmth radiating through the room, the hypnotic dance of the embers. It was my ritual, my meditation, my escape from the stresses of the day. My wife, Beatrice, a woman of impeccable taste and a slightly more refined sensibility than my own, also appreciated the fireplace, though perhaps for different reasons. She loved the ambience it created, the soft glow that flattered her complexion, and the excuse it provided to curl up with a good book and a glass of Merlot. Even our golden retriever, Winston, seemed to understand the significance of the fireplace. He would invariably claim the prime spot in front of the hearth, his tail thumping contentedly against the hardwood floor as the flames danced merrily in the grate. The aroma of burning wood was, for us, the olfactory embodiment of home. It was the scent of comfort, of relaxation, of shared moments and quiet contentment. It was the scent that permeated our lives, weaving itself into the fabric of our memories. Little did I know that this simple pleasure, this harmless indulgence, was about to become the focal point of a battle that would pit me against the very forces of suburban conformity. A battle that would ultimately lead to a smoky showdown at the Meadow Creek Estates clubhouse. A battle that would be remembered, at least by me, for years to come. The Meadow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. Just the name itself could send a shiver down the spine of even the most hardened rebel. They were, in a word, meticulous. In another word, tyrannical. They governed our lives with an iron fist, disguised in a velvet glove of perfectly manicured lawns and flawlessly synchronized holiday decorations. The HOA was led by a triumvirate of supremely self-important individuals. There was Mrs. Higgins, a retired schoolteacher with a penchant for correcting grammar and a seemingly endless supply of passive-aggressive sticky notes. Then there was Mr. Abernathy, a former accountant whose lifeblood was spreadsheets and whose greatest joy was finding discrepancies in the community budget, even if those discrepancies amounted to a few cents. And finally, the undisputed queen of the HOA, Mrs. van der Linde, a woman whose pedigree was as long as her list of complaints and whose sense of entitlement could rival that of royalty. Their rule book, a document thicker than a dictionary, contained regulations on everything from the acceptable shade of exterior paint, eggshell, and only eggshell, to the maximum height of grass, 2.5 inches, precisely, to the type of flowers permitted in window boxes, geraniums, petunias, and impatiens. In that order, we had all, at one point or another, fallen afoul of the HOA's rigid rules. That I myself had received a strongly worded letter regarding the unauthorized placement of a gnome in my rose garden. Apparently, gnomes were considered tacky and detrimental to the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood. Beatrice had been cited for leaving her recycling bin out for an excessive period, a mere 4 hours, as I recall. Even Winston had been the subject of scrutiny, accused of excessive barking, a charge I vehemently denied, arguing that he was simply expressing his enthusiasm for squirrels. These petty grievances, these seemingly insignificant infringements on our freedom, were more than just annoyances. They were a constant reminder that we were living under the watchful eye of an organization that valued conformity above all else. They were a slow, insidious erosion of our individuality, a gradual chipping away at our sense of self. Looking back, I can see that the seeds of rebellion were sown long before the fateful letter arrived. The simmering resentment, the quiet defiance, the unspoken desire to break free from the shackles of suburban conformity, it was all there, lurking beneath the surface of our seemingly placid lives. The fireplace incident, as it would later be known, was simply the catalyst, the spark that ignited the powder keg of pent-up frustration that had been building for years. The HOA, in their infinite wisdom, had poked the bear, and they were about to learn just how fiercely that bear could roar, and how much smoke it could produce. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Nestled amongst the usual junk mail and bills. It was a crisp, white envelope embossed with the Meadow Creek Estates HOA logo. A stylized rendering of a perfectly symmetrical oak tree. I almost didn't open it, assuming it was just another reminder about proper lawn maintenance or the upcoming neighborhood potluck. But something about the weight of the envelope, the official-looking font, gave me a sense of foreboding. I tore it open. With a growing sense of unease, the letter, written in the sterile, impersonal language of bureaucracy, began with the usual pleasantries, thanking me for my continued commitment to maintaining the high standards of Meadow Creek Estates. But then came the hammer blow. It has come to the attention of the Meadow Creek Estates Homeowners Association, the letter continued, that the smoke emanating from your chimney has been deemed a nuisance to several residents. Specifically, concerns have been raised regarding the odor and potential health hazards associated with smoke. The letter went on to state that, effective immediately, the use of fireplaces within Meadow Creek Estates was strictly prohibited. Violators would be subject to fines and potential legal action. I stared at the letter in disbelief. Nuisance. Health hazard. My fireplace. It was absurd. My fireplace was a source of joy, of comfort, of warmth. It was a symbol of home. How could anyone consider it a nuisance? Rage began to simmer within me. A slow burn that threatened to consume me entirely. This wasn't just about a fireplace. It was about control, about the HOA's relentless encroachment on our lives, about their utter disregard for our individual freedoms. I crumpled the letter in my fist, the paper crackling in protest. Beatrice walked into the room, drawn by the sound. "What's wrong, Arthur?" she asked, her brow furrowed with concern. I thrust the crumpled letter into her hand. She read it quickly, her expression shifting from curiosity to shock to outrage. "They can't do this," she exclaimed, her voice rising in indignation. "It's ridiculous." "Tell me about it," I said, my voice tight with anger. "They're banning our fireplace. Our fireplace, Beatrice, the one thing that makes this place feel like home." Winston, sensing the tension in the room, whined softly and nudged my leg with his wet nose. I knelt down and stroked his fur, trying to calm myself. "Well, we're not going to take this lying down," Beatrice declared, her eyes flashing with defiance. "We're going to fight this." And so the battle lines were drawn. The idyllic tranquility of Meadow Creek Estates was about to be shattered by the smoky rebellion of Arthur Penhaligon, a man who simply wanted to enjoy a fire in his own damn fireplace. The HOA had made a grave mistake. They had underestimated my love for my fireplace, and they were about to pay the price, despite Beatrice's fiery declaration. I initially opted for a more diplomatic approach. I believed that reason and common sense could prevail, that the HOA board members, even Mrs. van der Linde, could be persuaded to see the error of their ways. I was, as it turned out, hopelessly naive. The next HOA meeting was held at the clubhouse, a sterile, windowless room that felt more like a detention center than a community gathering space. The air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and unspoken resentment. I arrived armed with data, statistics, and a carefully rehearsed speech. I had researched the environmental impact of wood smoke, highlighting the fact that my modern, EPA-certified fireplace emitted significantly less pollution than older models. I had gathered testimonials from neighbors who enjoyed the scent of my chimney smoke, describing it as cozy and nostalgic. I even brought a professionally printed poster board displaying a graph comparing the air quality in Meadow Creek Estates to that of major metropolitan areas. Meadow Creek was, unsurprisingly, significantly cleaner. When my turn came to speak, I presented my arguments with calm and measured tones, appealing to the board's sense of reason and fairness. I emphasized the importance of individual freedoms and the right to enjoy one's property without undue interference. I even offered to install a smoke detector in Mrs. van der Linde's house just to alleviate any concerns about potential health hazards. But it was all for naught. Mrs. Higgins, her lips pursed into a disapproving line, interrupted me repeatedly with pedantic questions about the proper use of semicolons. Mr. Abernathy, his eyes glazed over with boredom, shuffled through a stack of spreadsheets, seemingly oblivious to my impassioned plea. And Mrs. Vanderlyn, her nose held high in the air, simply dismissed my arguments as self-serving and irrelevant. "The fact remains, Mr. Penhaligon," she declared, her voice dripping with disdain, "that several residents have complained about your chimney smoke. And as the HOA board, it is our duty to protect the interests of the community as a whole." She then proceeded to lecture me about the importance of conformity, the need to maintain property values, and the dangers of unchecked individualism. It was clear that her mind was made up, that no amount of evidence or persuasion would sway her from her predetermined course. Defeated and disheartened, I returned to my seat, the poster board drooping in my hands. Beatrice squeezed my arm in a gesture of support, but even her presence couldn't alleviate the crushing sense of futility. As the meeting adjourned, Mrs. Vanderlyn approached me, a smug smile playing on her lips. "I hope you'll reconsider your stance on this matter, Mr. Penhaligon," she said, her voice laced with condescension. "We wouldn't want to have to take further action." That was the moment I knew that diplomacy had failed. The HOA had shown its true colors, rigid, unyielding, and utterly impervious to reason. It was time to abandon the path of peaceful negotiation and embrace a more creative approach. The smoky surprise was about to be unleashed. The sting of defeat at the HOA meeting lingered, but it didn't break me. It fueled me. If they wouldn't listen to reason, I would find another way. I was, after all, a man of principle. And my principle was simple. I had the right to enjoy my fireplace. That evening, after Beatrice had gone to bed, I retreated to my study, a haven of leather-bound books and dimly lit lamps. I fired up my computer and began to delve into the labyrinthine world of local ordinances and property laws. Hours melted away as I navigated through countless websites, legal documents, and obscure court rulings. I was searching for a loophole, a legal technicality, anything that would allow me to circumvent the HOA's draconian ban. And eventually, after what felt like an eternity, I found it. Buried deep within the county's property code was a clause regarding the reasonable enjoyment of one's property. The clause stated that homeowners had the right to use their property in a manner that did not unreasonably interfere with the rights of their neighbors. The key word, of course, was unreasonably. What constituted an unreasonable interference was open to interpretation, and that, I realized, was where I could exploit the system. The HOA had argued that my chimney smoke was a nuisance, a health hazard, and a detriment to property values. But they hadn't defined what level of smoke constituted a nuisance, what level of health hazard was unacceptable, or what degree of property value decline was considered detrimental. Furthermore, the ordinance stipulated that any restrictions on property use had to be reasonable and proportionate to the alleged harm. Banning fireplaces altogether, I argued to myself, was neither reasonable nor proportionate. It was an overreaction, a heavy-handed attempt to impose their will on the community. The loophole was there, shimmering like a mirage in the legal desert. Now, I just had to figure out how to exploit it. I needed a way to generate smoke, lots of smoke, but in a way that was technically legal, that didn't violate any specific ordinances, and that didn't pose a genuine health risk. The idea came to me in a flash of inspiration as I was idly scrolling through an online catalog of industrial equipment. Industrial fans, powerful, high-velocity fans designed to move massive quantities of air. If I could combine the smoke from my fireplace with the force of these fans, I could create a localized smoke event that would be impossible to ignore. It wouldn't be subtle. It wouldn't be elegant, but it would be effective. And more importantly, it would be perfectly legal. I smiled, a slow, predatory grin spreading across my face. The HOA had drawn first blood, but I was about to even the score. The smoky surprise was about to become a reality. The plan, as it solidified in my mind, was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive engineering. It was perfectly legal, meticulously researched, and guaranteed to be the most annoying thing the HOA had ever encountered. It was, in short, the perfect revenge. The key was the industrial fans. I envisioned them strategically positioned around my property, their powerful blades churning the air, creating a vortex of smoke that would engulf the neighborhood. The smoke itself would be harmless. Of course, that I would use only seasoned hardwood, the kind that produced minimal creosote and a pleasant aroma, but the sheer volume of smoke, propelled by the force of the fans, would be undeniable. It would be impossible for the HOA to ignore. And because I was technically using my fireplace on my property and not violating any specific ordinances, They would have no legal grounds to stop me. I spent the next few days meticulously planning the operation. I measured distances, calculated wind speeds, and consulted with a local HVAC technician to ensure that my plan was feasible. I even created a detailed diagram of my property, showing the optimal placement of the fans and the projected trajectory of the smoke plume. The goal was not to cause any actual damage or harm. I simply wanted to make life as uncomfortable as possible for the HOA, to demonstrate the absurdity of their ban, and to remind them that homeowners had rights. Even in Meadow Creek Estates, I knew that my plan was risky. It could backfire, leading to fines, lawsuits, or even social ostracism. But I was willing to take that risk. I was tired of being bullied, tired of being told what I could and couldn't do on my own property. The HOA had declared war on my fireplace, and I was determined to fight back, armed with nothing more than a loophole, a few industrial fans, and a healthy dose of suburban spite. The first step was to acquire the fans. I scoured online retailers, searching for the most powerful and efficient models. I eventually settled on 3 high-velocity fans, each capable of moving thousands of cubic feet of air per minute. They were large, noisy, and somewhat intimidating, but they were exactly what I needed. I ordered them online, and they arrived a few days later, delivered by a bewildered UPS driver who seemed unsure of what to make of my unusual purchase. I unloaded the fans from the truck. I couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement. The plan was coming together. The smoky surprise was about to be unleashed. The HOA was in for a very long and very smoky day. The installation of the industrial fans was a delicate operation, requiring stealth, precision, and a healthy dose of disregard for my neighbors' opinions. I chose a day when most people were at work, hoping to minimize the number of prying eyes. The fans were heavy and unwieldy, and it took me several hours to maneuver them into their designated positions. I placed one fan directly behind the chimney, angled upwards to catch the rising smoke. The other 2 were positioned on either side of my property line, aimed towards the general direction of the HOA clubhouse. I worked. I couldn't help but notice the curtains twitching in the windows of neighboring houses. Mrs. Henderson, the neighborhood busybody, emerged from her house, ostensibly to water her petunias, but her gaze was fixed firmly on my activities. "Arthur, dear," she called out, her voice dripping with curiosity and thinly veiled disapproval. "What are you doing with those contraptions?" "Just a little landscaping, Martha," I replied, trying to sound nonchalant. "Trying to improve the airflow in the yard." She raised a skeptical eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "Well, they certainly are large. I hope they're not too noisy." "Don't worry, Martha," I assured her. "They're very quiet, state-of-the-art technology." She continued to watch me for a few more minutes, her expression a mixture of suspicion and fascination, before finally retreating back into her house. I could almost hear the gears turning in her mind as she tried to decipher the purpose of my mysterious project. Word spread quickly, as it always does in a small suburban community. By the end of the day, the entire neighborhood was buzzing with speculation about the industrial fans. Some people thought I was starting a wind farm. Others believed I was building some kind of elaborate ventilation system. A few even whispered that I was secretly running a marijuana grow operation. The gossip added a layer of suspense to the operation. I knew that the HOA would eventually find out about my plan, but I wanted to delay the inevitable confrontation for as long as possible. The longer I could keep them guessing, the greater the element of surprise would be. As darkness fell, I stood in my backyard, admiring my handiwork. The industrial fans loomed large in the night, their dark silhouettes casting ominous shadows across the lawn. I could almost feel the collective anxiety of the neighborhood as they waited with bated breath to see what I would do next. The stage was set. The players were in place. The smoky surprise was just hours away from being unleashed. The HOA had no idea what was coming, and that, I thought, was the best part of all. Before unleashing the full force of my smoky surprise on the HOA clubhouse, I decided to conduct a test run. I needed to gauge the effectiveness of the fans, to fine-tune the smoke trajectory, and, perhaps most importantly, to observe the reaction of my primary target, Mrs. van der Linde. I chose a clear, windless evening for the test. The sun had just begun to set, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns of Meadow Creek Estates. I carefully built a fire in my fireplace, using only seasoned oak and hickory, the kind that produced a rich, aromatic smoke. Once the fire was burning steadily, I activated the industrial fans. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The smoke, which would normally have dissipated harmlessly into the atmosphere, was now channeled into a concentrated plume. Propelled forward with tremendous force, I had adjusted the angle of the fans to direct the smoke towards Mrs. Van der Lin's house, which was located a few doors down from mine. Her house, a sprawling McMansion with a meticulously landscaped yard, was the epitome of suburban ostentation. It was a fitting target for my smoky assault. I watched from my backyard as the plume of smoke began to engulf Mrs. Van der Lin's property. It swirled around her rose bushes, obscured her perfectly symmetrical hedges, and even seemed to penetrate the closed windows of her house. I couldn't see Mrs. Van der Lin herself, but I could imagine her reaction. I pictured her peering out from behind her curtains, her face contorted with rage and indignation. I imagined her frantically dialing the number for the HOA, her voice trembling with fury. After about 15 minutes, I decided to shut down the fans. The test run had been a success. I had proven that my plan was feasible, that I could effectively weaponize my chimney smoke, and that I could inflict a considerable amount of annoyance on my nemesis. As the smoke cleared, I noticed that Mrs. Van der Lin's front door had opened, and she was standing on her porch, her hands on her hips, glaring in my direction. She was a formidable figure, her face flushed with anger, her eyes blazing with fury. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but I could lip-read her words. "Arthur Penhaligon, you haven't heard the last of this." I simply smiled and waved, then retreated back into my house, feeling a surge of satisfaction. The smoky surprise was about to go live, and Mrs. Van der Lin was about to get a whole lot more than she bargained for. The HOA meeting at the clubhouse was only a day away. It was time to prepare for the main event. The day of the HOA meeting dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the smoky chaos I was about to unleash. I spent the morning meticulously preparing for the main event. I chopped wood, stacked it neatly beside the fireplace, and made sure the chimney was clear of any obstructions. As the afternoon approached, I began to stoke the fire, feeding it logs and kindling until it roared with a fierce intensity. The heat radiating from the hearth was almost unbearable, but I knew that the more smoke I produced, the more effective my plan would be. Meanwhile, at the clubhouse, the HOA meeting was getting underway. I imagined Mrs. Van der Lin, Mrs. Higgins, and Mr. Abernathy sitting at the head table, smugly confident in their authority, completely oblivious to the smoky storm that was about to descend upon them. Around 7 p.m., the time the meeting was scheduled to begin, I put the final touches on my preparations. I adjusted the angle of the industrial fans, making sure they were aimed directly at the clubhouse. I donned a pair of safety goggles and a dust mask to protect myself from the worst of the smoke. Then, with a deep breath, I activated the fans. The effect was even more dramatic than it had been during the test run. The smoke billowed out of my chimney, forming a thick, swirling cloud that quickly enveloped my entire property. The industrial fans roared to life, their blades churning the air with ferocious intensity. The smoke plume shot forward, a dense, gray mass that streaked across the sky like a rogue storm cloud. I watched with a mixture of apprehension and exhilaration as the smoke made its way towards the clubhouse. It engulfed the building in a matter of minutes, obscuring the windows and blanketing the parking lot. I could only imagine the scene inside the clubhouse. The HOA board members, choking on the smoke, their eyes watering, their faces contorted with disbelief and outrage. The other residents, coughing and sputtering, scrambling for the exits. The entire meeting thrown into complete and utter chaos. The smoky surprise had been unleashed, and it was glorious. I continued to monitor the situation from my backyard, feeding the fire and adjusting the fans to maintain the optimal level of smoke production. I wanted to make sure that the HOA got the message loud and clear. They had banned my fireplace, claiming that it was a nuisance. Now, they were about to experience a real nuisance. A nuisance that was perfectly legal, meticulously planned, and utterly unforgettable. The Battle of Meadow Creek Estates had begun. Inside the clubhouse, pandemonium reigned. The smoke, thick and acrid, filled the room with alarming speed. It stung the eyes, tickled the throat, and left a lingering taste of ash on the tongue. The first sign of trouble was the fire alarm. A piercing shriek shattered the air, sending a jolt of panic through the assembled residents. People jumped to their feet, knocking over chairs and scattering papers. Mrs. Higgins, her face ashen, clutched her chest and gasped for air. Mr. Abernathy, his glasses fogged over, stumbled blindly towards the exit, his spreadsheets fluttering to the floor, and Mrs. Van der Lin, Her meticulously coiffed hair askew, her designer dress covered in soot, screamed at the top of her lungs, "What is going on? What is happening?" The smoke continued to pour into the room, making it difficult to see or breathe. People began coughing uncontrollably, their bodies racked with violent spasms. The air was filled with the sounds of hacking, wheezing, and panicked cries. Some residents, realizing that the fire alarm was likely a false one, attempted to open the windows, but they were quickly overwhelmed by the sheer volume of smoke pouring in from outside. Others tried to call 911, but their phone calls were met with busy signals. The local emergency services were already inundated with calls from concerned residents reporting a fire at the Meadow Creek Estates clubhouse. The scene was one of utter chaos. People were pushing and shoving, desperate to escape the smoky inferno. The HOA board members, their authority completely undermined, were powerless to restore order. Even Winston, who had accompanied Beatrice to the meeting, was caught up in the confusion. He barked frantically, darting back and forth between the legs of the fleeing residents, adding to the general sense of panic. Beatrice, however, remained remarkably calm. She had anticipated that my plan might cause a bit of a stir, and she was prepared for the consequences. She calmly navigated her way through the crowd, helping elderly residents to safety and reassuring frightened children. As the smoke thickened and the chaos intensified, I couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication. The HOA had dismissed my concerns, ignored my arguments, and banned my fireplace. Now, they were experiencing the true meaning of nuisance. The smoky surprise had exceeded all expectations. It was a masterpiece of suburban warfare, a perfectly executed act of revenge. And it was all perfectly legal. Or at least, I hoped it was, from the relative safety of my backyard. I watched the unfolding drama with a complex mix of emotions. Satisfaction, certainly. There was an undeniable thrill in seeing my plan come to fruition, in witnessing the HOA's carefully constructed facade of order crumble into smoky disarray. They had underestimated me, and they were now paying the price. But there was also a gnawing sense of apprehension. I knew that my actions had consequences, and I couldn't be sure what those consequences would be. Had I gone too far? Had I crossed the line from clever protest to outright vandalism? Had I jeopardized my own future in Meadow Creek Estates? The sight of the fleeing residents, their faces etched with fear and confusion, gave me pause. I hadn't intended to cause genuine harm or distress. My goal was to make a point. To challenge the HOA's authority, not to terrorize my neighbors. I also worried about Beatrice. I knew that she supported my cause, but I couldn't help but wonder if she secretly disapproved of my methods. Had I put her in an awkward position, forcing her to choose between loyalty to me and her own sense of propriety? As the evening wore on, the smoke gradually began to dissipate. The fire alarms eventually fell silent. The emergency services arrived, assessed the situation, and determined that there was no actual fire. The residents slowly began to emerge from the clubhouse, their clothes disheveled, their faces streaked with soot. They gathered in small groups, whispering and gesturing, their eyes fixed on my house. I knew that it was only a matter of time before someone came knocking on my door, and I knew that when they did, I would have to face the music. I took a deep breath, extinguished the fire in my fireplace, and shut down the industrial fans. The sudden silence was deafening. The air was still thick with the scent of smoke, but the chaos had subsided. I walked towards the front of my house, steeling myself for the inevitable confrontation. I was ready to defend my actions, to explain my motives, and to accept whatever consequences might come my way. But as I reached the front door, I hesitated. A wave of doubt washed over me. Had I done the right thing? Or had I simply made things worse? The answer, I suspected, was about to become painfully clear. The knock on the door was sharp and insistent, betraying the barely contained fury of the person on the other side. I took a deep breath and opened it. Standing on my porch, her face contorted with rage, her clothes still bearing the faint scent of smoke, was Mrs. Vanderlyn. Behind her, I could see a small group of neighbors, their faces a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Arthur Penhaligon," she exclaimed, her voice trembling with indignation. "What in the name of all that is holy do you think you were doing?" "I was exercising my right to the reasonable enjoyment of my property," I replied, trying to remain calm. "Reasonable enjoyment? You nearly asphyxiated the entire neighborhood. You set off the fire alarm. You caused thousands of dollars in damage." "I didn't cause any damage," I countered. "I simply generated some smoke, and I did it all within the bounds of the law." "The law?" she scoffed. "You twisted the law to suit your own selfish purposes. You are a menace to this community, Arthur Penhaligon." and I will see to it that you are held accountable for your actions." "Accountable for what?" I asked, raising my voice slightly. "For wanting to enjoy a fire in my own fireplace? For standing up to your tyrannical HOA? For reminding you that homeowners have rights?" "This isn't about rights," she screamed, her voice cracking with emotion. "This is about respect. This is about following the rules. This is about maintaining the standards of Meadow Creek Estates." "And what standards are those, Mrs. Vanderlyn?" I retorted. "The standard of conformity, the standard of suppressing individuality, the standard of allowing a handful of petty bureaucrats to dictate every aspect of our lives." Our voices rose, echoing through the quiet suburban street. The neighbors who had gathered behind Mrs. Vanderlyn began to murmur, their faces reflecting a growing sense of unease. "You are a disgrace, Arthur Penhaligon," Mrs. Vanderlyn shrieked. "You are a troublemaker. You are a chimney criminal." "And you, Mrs. Vanderlyn," I replied, my voice dripping with sarcasm, "are a chimney bully. And I, for one, am not going to let you push me around any longer." Our argument escalated, each of us hurling accusations and insults at the other. The neighbors, drawn by the commotion, began to spill out of their houses, adding to the growing crowd. Soon, the entire street was lined with onlookers, their faces a mixture of shock, amusement, and morbid curiosity. The Battle of Meadow Creek Estates had spilled out into the open, and it was about to get a whole lot more interesting. As Mrs. Vanderlyn continued her tirade, I noticed something unexpected happening in the crowd of onlookers. Some of my neighbors, initially hesitant and uncertain, were starting to nod their heads in agreement with my arguments. Mr. Johnson, whose prize-winning vegetable garden had been threatened with demolition because it violated the HOA's aesthetic guidelines, gave me a subtle thumbs up. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had been fined for painting her front door a shade of blue that was deemed unharmonious with the neighborhood's color palette, offered me a sympathetic smile. Even Mrs. Henderson, the neighborhood busybody, seemed to be wavering. I could see her lips moving, as if she were silently rehearsing the arguments I had made against the HOA's overreaching authority. It became clear that I wasn't alone in my frustration with the HOA. Many of my neighbors had their own grievances, their own stories of petty regulations and arbitrary enforcement. They had simply been too afraid to speak out, too intimidated by the HOA's power. But now, seeing me stand up to Mrs. Vanderlyn, seeing me challenge the HOA's authority, they were finding their own voices. They were realizing that they weren't powerless, that they could resist the HOA's tyranny. "He's right, you know," Mr. Johnson said, stepping forward. "This HOA has gone too far. They're always telling us what we can and can't do on our own property." "Yeah," Mrs. Rodriguez added. "It's like we're living in a dictatorship. They treat us like children." "And that chimney ban was ridiculous," Mrs. Henderson chimed in, surprising everyone. "I actually enjoyed the smell of Arthur's fireplace. It reminded me of my childhood." The crowd began to murmur in agreement, their voices growing louder and more confident. Mrs. Vanderlyn, her face flushed with anger, looked around in disbelief. "You can't be serious," she exclaimed. "You're actually siding with this lawbreaker?" "We're siding with fairness, Mrs. Vanderlyn," Mr. Johnson replied. "We're siding with common sense. We're siding with Arthur." A cheer erupted from the crowd. People began clapping and shouting words of support. Mrs. Vanderlyn, realizing that she was losing control of the situation, sputtered in frustration. "This is outrageous," she shrieked. "I will not tolerate this insubordination. I will report all of you to the HOA. You will all be fined. You will all be smoke-shamed." But her threats fell on deaf ears. The neighbors, emboldened by their newfound solidarity, simply ignored her. They had found their voice, and they were no longer afraid to use it. The Battle of Meadow Creek Estates had taken an unexpected turn. It was no longer just a fight between me and the HOA. It had become a full-blown rebellion, a grassroots movement against suburban tyranny. And I, the chimney criminal, had become its unlikely leader. The following morning, the Battle of Meadow Creek Estates made the leap from local gossip to regional news. A reporter from the local television station, alerted by one of my more media-savvy neighbors, arrived in Meadow Creek, camera crew in tow. They interviewed me, Mrs. Vanderlyn, who looked even more disheveled and furious than she had the night before, and several of my supportive neighbors. The story that emerged was a classic David versus Goliath narrative. A lone homeowner standing up against the overbearing regulations of a tyrannical HOA. The reporter, a young woman with a knack for finding the human angle in every story, framed the conflict as a battle for individual freedom, a fight against the creeping encroachment of bureaucratic control. She highlighted the absurdity of the chimney ban, the pettiness of the HOA's regulations, and the courage of the residents who were finally speaking out. The story aired on the evening news, complete with dramatic footage of the smoke-filled clubhouse, interviews with coughing residents, and close-ups of my industrial fans. It quickly went viral, spreading across social media like wildfire. Suddenly, I was a local celebrity. People recognized me on the street, offering words of encouragement and support. I received phone calls and emails from homeowners across the country, sharing their own horror stories about HOAs and praising my bravery. The media attention put immense pressure on the HOA. They were inundated with negative publicity, ridiculed on social media, and subjected to a barrage of angry phone calls and emails. Even the county government took notice. The county supervisor, sensing an opportunity to score some political points, issued a statement condemning the HOA's actions and promising to review the county's property code to ensure that homeowners' rights were protected. Mrs. Vanderlyn, Mrs. Higgins, and Mr. Abernathy, once smugly confident in their authority, were now scrambling to contain the damage. They issued a series of increasingly desperate statements, attempting to justify their actions and downplay the severity of the situation. But it was too late. The tide had turned. The media had shone a spotlight on the HOA's overreach, and the public had overwhelmingly sided with me. The Battle of Meadow Creek Estates was far from over, but it was clear that the HOA was losing ground. Their carefully constructed facade of authority was crumbling, and their power was rapidly eroding. The smoky surprise had not only disrupted their meeting, it had exposed their tyranny to the world. And that, I realized, was the most satisfying revenge of all. The media firestorm, combined with the growing unrest within Meadow Creek Estates, proved too much for the HOA to withstand. Facing mounting public scrutiny, potential legal challenges, and the very real possibility of a complete revolt within their ranks, they were forced to back down. A week after the smoky surprise, the HOA issued a formal statement rescinding the chimney ban. The statement, drafted by a team of high-priced lawyers, was carefully worded to minimize the HOA's embarrassment and avoid any admission of wrongdoing. It claimed that the HOA had reevaluated its position on the issue, taking into account the concerns of the community and the importance of individual freedoms. It also stated that the HOA would be forming a committee to review and revise its regulations to ensure that they were reasonable, proportionate, and consistent with the values of Meadow Creek Estates. In reality, the HOA had been forced to capitulate. The media attention had exposed their overreach, the neighbors' rebellion had undermined their authority, and the threat of legal action had frightened them into submission. Mrs. Vanderlyn, Mrs. Higgins, and Mr. Abernathy, their faces etched with defeat, announced their resignations from the HOA board. A new election was scheduled, and a slate of reform-minded candidates, inspired by my actions, stepped forward to challenge the status quo. The Battle of Meadow Creek Estates was finally over, and I, the chimney criminal, had emerged victorious. The news of the HOA's reversal spread quickly through the neighborhood, sparking a spontaneous celebration. People gathered in the streets, cheering and applauding. Mr. Johnson brought out his prize-winning vegetables and shared them with everyone. Mrs. Rodriguez painted her front door a vibrant shade of blue, and Mrs. Henderson, bless her heart, baked a batch of chimney-shaped cookies. Beatrice, beaming with pride, wrapped her arms around me and whispered in my ear, "I always knew you could do it. Arthur, you're my hero." Even Winston seemed to sense the victory. He wagged his tail furiously and barked with delight, as if he understood that his beloved fireplace was safe once again. As the sun set over Meadow Creek Estates, casting a golden glow on the jubilant scene, I couldn't help but feel a sense of profound satisfaction that I had stood up to tyranny. I had defended my rights, and I had inspired others to do the same. The smoky surprise had not only disrupted an HOA meeting, it had transformed a community, and that, I realized, was a victory worth celebrating. The victory in Meadow Creek Estates transformed me, almost overnight, into a symbol of resistance against tyrannical HOAs. I was interviewed by national news outlets, invited to speak at homeowners' rights conferences, and even offered a book deal, which I politely declined. People from all over the country reached out to me, seeking advice and support in their own battles against overbearing regulations and petty bureaucrats. I became a de facto champion of homeowners' rights, spending countless hours answering emails, making phone calls, and offering encouragement to those who were struggling against the same kind of tyranny I had faced in Meadow Creek. The new HOA board, elected by a landslide, proved to be everything the old board was not: reasonable, responsive, and respectful of individual freedoms. They repealed many of the most egregious regulations, fostered a spirit of community cooperation, and even organized a neighborhood bonfire to celebrate the end of the Chimney Band. Mrs. Van der Lin, Mrs. Higgins, and Mr. Abernathy faded into obscurity, their power and influence diminished, their reputations tarnished. They remained in Meadow Creek, but they were no longer the arbiters of suburban conformity. As for me, I tried to return to my ordinary life, to the simple pleasures that had been threatened by the HOA's overreach. That I spent more time tending my rose garden, reading books in my study, and playing fetch with Winston in the backyard. But I couldn't completely escape my newfound celebrity. I was still recognized on the street, still asked for advice, still celebrated as a local hero. And I was okay with that. I had learned that even an ordinary person could make a difference, that even a small act of defiance could spark a revolution. One evening, as the autumn leaves began to turn, I built a fire in my fireplace. The flames crackled merrily, casting a warm glow on the room. Beatrice curled up beside me on the couch, a glass of Merlot in her hand. Winston sprawled out on the hearth, his tail thumping contentedly against the floor. The aroma of burning wood filled the air, a comforting scent that I had almost lost forever. That I took a deep breath, savoring the moment, feeling a sense of peace and contentment that I hadn't experienced in months. The Battle of Meadow Creek Estates was over. The HOA had been defeated, and I, the chimney criminal, had finally earned the right to enjoy a peaceful evening by the fire. It was, in every sense of the word, perfection.